independent assurance review of the effectiveness of multi-agency responses to child sexual exploitation in Greater Manchester. And part 2 report concerns Oldham, as you know. So, if I may, just to introduce the panel to you, you'll be hearing them all. We're joined this morning by Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, Stephen Watson. Next to Stephen is Amanda Chatterton, Councillor Chatterton, the leader of Oldham Borough Council. Next to Amanda, Baroness Beverly Hughes, Deputy Mayor, Greater Manchester. And then at the far end of the table, Malcolm Newsom, CBE, and Gary Ridgway, our independent review team. And I'll invite Malcolm to speak shortly. So let me just, if I may, set out the background. I set up this overarching review shortly after coming into office in 2017 because I wanted people in Greater Manchester to be able to have confidence in our arrangements for protecting and safeguarding children. In 2005, a major investigation into child sexual exploitation in Manchester had been closed down at short notice, creating doubts that the wrong motives were driving decision-making. And there were allegations of similar elsewhere in the city region. Public confidence comes from a willingness to be unflinching in facing up to these claims and being honest about the past, however difficult that may be. It comes from establishing, beyond any doubt, that decision-making on this most critical of issues will be driven only by what needs to be done to protect our children, and never by institutional or political concerns. And it comes also from a readiness to bring perpetrators to justice, regardless of the passage of time. It is never too late to face up to past mistakes, to say sorry to those who were failed, nor to prosecute those responsible for appalling crimes against children and young people. This review is helping us do all of those things, and slowly but surely allowing the public to have confidence again. Following the first report, Operation Green Jacket was set up by Greater Manchester Police, and it has so far led to 21 arrests. Operation Lytton, investigating abuse in Rochdale, led to charges against 8 people in March this year, with the trial set for next year. This progress has been achieved through a new GMP force-wide child sexual exploitation unit, which, as you will hear from the Chief Constable, is receiving an uplift in staffing so that it is ready to act on the findings of this Part 2 report. I think it is important for people in Oldham to know that this report and this process of inquiry in Oldham only came about because Oldham politicians had the courage to ask for it, knowing that it was needed to take their community forward. So I would like to thank the former leaders of Oldham Council, Sean Fielding and Aruj Shah, for the leadership they have shown, and this is being continued by the new leader of Oldham, Amanda Chatterton, and we will hear from Amanda shortly. But first, I want to invite Malcolm Newsom to present the findings of his report. Malcolm.
Good morning, everybody. In November 2019, we were asked by Oldham Council and the Mayor of Greater Manchester to undertake a review into safeguarding practices in the Borough of Oldham. Our terms of reference required us to provide assurance regarding allegations made on social media about the risks posed to children in Oldham from child sexual exploitation. We were asked primarily to focus our review between the periods 2011 to 2014, but had authority to extend this timeframe, if necessary, to enable us to provide the necessary assurances. We acknowledge the significant strength of feeling locally in relation to this review and the commentary on social media. We are very grateful to the many individuals who have given their time to support us in our work, and also the immense amount of work to recover the significant amount of documentary evidence we have reviewed. We believe we've produced a thorough, diligent and independent report, not influenced by any party, and have set out in the appendices the significant amount of evidence we have considered before reaching our final conclusions. We've set out in Chapter 1 a summary of our key findings. These are covered in more detail in the respective chapters that form the body of the report. Chapter 2 sets out our methodology and the timeline for bringing forward the report to publication. For legal reasons, our report also contains confidential appendices which will not be published. We've summarised the conclusions of these confidential sections in our published report. I'll now turn to our key messages. We have found that throughout this period, the specialist services tackling child sexual exploitation provided by Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police were strategically ahead of those available in many other local authorities at the time. However, these did not always translate at an operational level into the effective safeguarding of children experiencing sexual exploitation. Our own review of a sample of children has exposed significant failings in the protection provided by the statutory authorities to those children. We understand that Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police have agreed to review the management of these cases to consider whether any further action can now be taken in respect of the men who exploited these children. We have been provided with no evidence to support the allegations circulated on social media to suggest that senior managers or counsellors sought to cover up either the existence of child sexual exploitation in Oldham or the complexity involved in tackling the perpetrators. Turn to shisha bars now. A robust approach was taken by Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police to the emerging threat of child sexual exploitation posed by shisha bars between 2011 and 2014. Nonetheless, we have found evidence that a small number of children who were known to be sexually exploited were visiting shisha bars throughout 2011, 2012 and 2013. We have found no evidence that a BBC journalist, who we refer to as Journalist A, colluded with Oldham Council in not highlighting the potential threat presented by shisha bars. Quite to the contrary, we've seen clear evidence that Journalist A appropriately challenged and scrutinised the position held by both Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police, and continued to investigate the story which was eventually broadcast by the BBC. Residential care homes. We've been provided with no evidence to suggest there was widespread sexual exploitation of children in residential settings in Oldham. There is evidence that some children in residential settings were being exposed to child sexual exploitation. Some of these children had suffered this abuse prior to their admission. There is also evidence that some children who had not been exposed to sexual exploitation were drawn into it through the encouragement of other residents. However, the evidence suggests that residential staff worked in a professional and supportive way with these children to win their trust and protect them as far as possible from further abuse. We have concluded that there were, throughout this period, legitimate concerns on the part of both the council and the police that the high-profile convictions of predominantly Pakistani offenders across the country could be capitalised on by a far-right agenda and lead to the victimisation of the Pakistani community. Social cohesion and far-right activity had been a consistent focus of the public authorities in Oldham since the 2001 riots. However, it is clear from all the evidence we have seen that the council and its partners in no way avoided addressing this and in fact saw successful disruption and prosecution as the route to winning the confidence of all communities in Oldham. Taxi licensing. We have concluded that we've been provided with no evidence to suggest that senior managers or councillors sought to cover up the potential exploitation of children by local taxi services. We have found that the council licensing panel had previously approved several licences to individuals who had been either accused or convicted of serious sexual offences. However, this serious weakness was recognised in subsequent years and the council strengthened its licensing policies in line with the more robust national guidance. I'll now turn to Sophie. We have considered a specific complaint by a person we refer to as Sophie. In 2019, Sophie wrote an open letter to the leader of the council, and in summary, this letter contained serious allegations that Sophie was subjected to profound sexual exploitation, and that Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police failed in their duties to protect her. Sophie also complained that when these shortcomings were raised with both Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police, they failed to investigate them appropriately and denied any failures on their part. We have concluded that the interventions of both the Council and Greater Manchester Police and the investigations into her allegations fell far short of what was required to protect Sophie, who was only 12 years old at the time of her abuse. Furthermore, we have concluded that these failures have been compounded by the denials that have subsequently been issued to Sophie and also to the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee at the time. This lack of candour feeds the view that both agencies were more concerned about covering up their failures than acknowledging the harm that had been done to a vulnerable young person. We found no evidence that this approach was influenced by the leader of the council at the time or any other politician. However, we recommend in our report that both Greater Manchester Police and Oldham Council publicly acknowledge these serious failures and apologise to Sophie. We have also reviewed the cases of known offenders previously employed within Oldham Council, and we also considered councillors and others with positions in the council against whom serious allegations have been made. While we have included as much information as possible in our published report, for legal reasons we have placed some of the detail of our findings in a confidential appendix and have put our conclusions in the published report. We have concluded that there were a number of failings in the investigation of these cases, and these are set out in our report. I'll now turn to Offender A. A man we have called Offender A worked for Oldham Council between 1988 and 2006 as a welfare rights officer. In 2012, he was sentenced to 19 years imprisonment for serious offences relating to child sexual exploitation. And in June 2012, he was found guilty of a further 30 rape charges and was jailed for an additional 22 years. We have concluded that there were serious multiple failures by both Greater Manchester Police and Oldham Council to follow the procedures in place to investigate the threat he presented to children between 2005 and 2012. We believe that if the appropriate procedures had been followed, his offending behaviour could have been addressed at an earlier stage, and potentially the abuse of his subsequent victims may have been prevented. We have also considered the matter of a councillor we have called Councillor V, and the allegation on social media that he was victimised following the sharing of sensitive information in respect of shisha bars. We have concluded that there was a legitimate concern by both the leader of the council and the Police and Crime Commissioner at the time that confidential information had been inappropriately shared with a third party by Councillor V. We do not therefore believe that there were grounds to support the allegation that Councillor V had been victimised. Finally, we also reviewed the matter of another councillor we call Councillor Z and the allegation that he was punished for being a whistleblower. We believe that there were some inconsistencies and false assumptions in the report produced by an independent law firm into the standards complaint made against Councillor Z. We acknowledge, however, that the law firm acted in good faith and that the council was not responsible for the content of the independent investigation report or in any position to require the independent investigator to reconsider or amend their view. In conclusion, we would emphasise that during the period covered by our review, the strategic intent of senior leaders in Oldham was to tackle child sexual exploitation, and in that regard, they were ahead of many local areas. Nonetheless, our report has uncovered historic failings in the protection offered to specific vulnerable children at that time. There remains an opportunity for Greater Manchester Police and Oldham Council to now work with Sophie and the other survivors we have highlighted in our report to ensure that every opportunity is taken to bring the perpetrators who abuse them to justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. And can I thank you too, Gary, both of you, for the painstaking way in which you put this thorough report together. And we are all deeply grateful to you both. Could I now invite Councillor Amanda Chatterton to respond on behalf of Oldham Council? Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Firstly, thank you to Malcolm and Gary for a hugely detailed and thorough review. A huge amount of work has gone into getting us where we are today. The report makes for very difficult reading, and on behalf of Oldham Council, I firstly want to apologise to all the victims of CSE that are referenced in this report. I particularly want to apologise to Sophie. I would never pretend to be able to fully understand what she went through, but it is clear that the council and the police failed in our duty of care towards her, both when she was a child and through our subsequent responses to her as an adult, and for that I am truly sorry. I will be writing to all the victims in this report to offer an apology and to meet in person if they wish to discuss their experiences and learn how we can improve further. It is clear that at the time, the council and the police did not understand enough about this horrendous crime and how best to support and protect its victims. Much has changed since then. We've learnt from similar reports and reviews elsewhere in the country, from changes to national guidance and from best practice, and the way we deal with victims of this terrible abuse is now completely different. The report findings show that from 2011, the Council was trying hard to tackle CSE and improve the way that we do things. In 2019, when Oldham Council asked for this review to take place, this was in response to local concerns and around how the Council and the police had historically tackled CSE in Oldham. Central to those concerns was the allegation that there was a cover-up between Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police and that we actively hid this dreadful abuse. The report clearly states that nobody sought to cover up this terrible crime and that in fact the council was working hard to address it. It also very clearly highlights that senior councillors and officers were claiming their drive to improve social care. The council knew that CSE and grooming were a growing area of concern. A dedicated team of social workers working together with the police was set up in response to this. We were one of the first councils in the country to build this into a multi-agency safeguarding hub to deal with a wide range of severe abuse and neglect. We acted to disrupt businesses like shisha bars and other unlicensed premises where we would thought these crimes may have been committed. But the powers we had to work with weren't strong enough. Similarly, the national guidance that determines who can be given a taxi licence was also not strong enough to weed out potential perpetrators of sexual abuse. While we tried to root out anyone who may have been at risk, we should have been more robust in removing licences in a small number of cases. I can say categorically that this would not happen today. Our review processes are much more robust and drivers must have a criminal record check twice a year. In 2014, Ofsted held Oldham Council up as an example of leading the field in Greater Manchester for tackling CSE. We even developed a play that toured schools called Somebody's Daughter, Somebody's Sister, which was shown to thousands of school children to teach them about the dangers of CSE and grooming. We didn't shy away from this issue, and we don't shy away from it today. The report recognises much of this work, but it does state that the political drive to improve did not always translate into good practice on the ground. Over the course of 2011 to 2014, over 11,000 referrals were made into Oldham Children's Social Care. The vast majority of those children received the support they needed and were kept safe. The report references some of the commendable work of our social workers in children's home, but it is clear that this wasn't true for all children, and one child let down is one child too many. It is absolutely imperative that our residents have confidence in those people that work to protect our children. Our social workers today do an unbelievable job in some very challenging circumstances with some very vulnerable people. But we have to be honest about the challenges they face, and these are challenges faced by social workers up and down the country, not just in Oldham. Our number one job is keeping children safe, but the scale of that task is immense. We have more children in need of social care today than ever before. To use an example, if you think of the Etihad Stadium, the children of Oldham will more than fill all of the stands of that stadium. We have 59,000 children and young people in Oldham. And those that are currently looked after and open to social care would fill the whole of the away end. That is 3,100 children that are currently suffering or at risk of abuse or neglect. We currently have over 600 referrals into social care each month, and our social workers work day and night to improve the lives of these children. I want to reassure people that we have not stood still, be it from 2006, 2011, 2014 or 2019 when this review was launched. Changes have already been made due to the work we've done ourselves, updates in national guidance and best practice, and findings from other reviews that have been carried out in towns and cities up and down the country. The way we work today is different and it's improved to how the council worked then, and these improvements have been recognised by Ofsted and others. The messenger service highlighted in the report was replaced in 2014, and the team have since moved into what we call our complex safeguarding hub. That team sits within Greater Manchester Police to ensure we're fully coordinated and can quickly act on all information we're given. We now have dedicated training officers for schools to teach young people about the signs of abuse and how to report them, with thousands of Oldham students undergoing these sessions last year. Licensing procedures have changed nationally so that no person who has been convicted of a sexual offence can be granted a taxi licence, and more safeguarding checks happen at taxi ranks and offices. All our elected members also now undergo mandatory safeguarding training, including specific training around CSE. These are some of the ways we have improved, but we are not complacent. Keeping children safe is a battle we face every single day. We are constantly learning, constantly evolving, and it is a journey of continuous improvement. As a relatively new leader of Oldham Council, I've been clear that children and young people are my #1 priority. We need to focus on making the town a better place for them as they grow up. Our role is to provide children and young people every chance to live the lives they deserve and the life they want to live. And that means making Oldham safer, it means investing in things like children's centres and activities for families and improving the grades that our young people are achieving. We can't turn back time and take away the experiences that young people of the past have had, but we can focus absolutely on making things better for children today and commit to work every single day to ensure that failings of the past are never repeated. We know that some people will be distressed by what they hear today, and we're here to help. We've put in place a dedicated team of people who are professionally trained to support anyone who wants to report historic abuse, and we will be offering support. All contact details are on our website and on social media. But I also believe that looking after our most vulnerable young people is the responsibility of everybody. And if you see something that concerns you, please report it to either the council or the police so we can make it stop. Wherever a report is made, we will ensure people receive the support they need and deserve, and we will continue to work tirelessly with the police to help bring those responsible to justice. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Amanda. Could I now invite the Chief Constable to respond on behalf of Greater Manchester Police?
Good morning all. I am Stephen Watson, the Chief Constable for Greater Manchester. I welcome this report and its publication and accept its findings in full. It does not make for easy reading in many parts. It speaks to an era, as is now commonly understood, where public authorities, including the police, all too often failed very vulnerable children. Despite the necessarily backward-looking character of this report, considering as it does a period in time of some 10 to 15 years ago and beyond, it does serve to remind us as to how far we have come in improving our responses to CSE, but it also shakes off any wrong-headed complacency that might otherwise exist, given the trauma and the harms that have afflicted children who have suffered so grievously. It also provides me with an opportunity to apologise to those whom we have failed. On too many occasions, we, the police, were not there for you when you desperately needed us, and for that, I am truly sorry. We have put arrangements in place such that I might meet with Sophie personally in order to express my apology to her face to face. I think the language of learning lessons has come to be perceived as somewhat hackneyed, and what I want to convey very clearly today is that the lessons of this report have already been learned and are well baked in to our current professional practice. I can say without equivocation that both our internal and multi-agency arrangements are today worlds apart from that described in this report. It can, however, never be said that we can't improve, but I do hope that the public, parents and families, and perhaps most importantly, vulnerable children themselves, might take some comfort from the fact that the wraparound services now present in Oldham, across Greater Manchester, and indeed across the country, are immensely superior to the weaknesses and poor practice exposed in this report. As to the next steps for GMP in taking this report further, I have a team in place who are working through every sentence and finding of this report in forensic detail. The purpose of the exercise is to tie up any loose ends from a parochial perspective and to assess current practice afresh so as to triply assure ourselves that no enduring weakness is present in our current systems. We have not waited for the publication of this report to seek to remedy the lost opportunities of the past. Last year, supported by a significant investment from the Mayor, we established in GMP a Force CSE unit, originally comprising 85 experienced investigators. In the light of this report, I have strengthened the team further through the allocation of 21 additional investigators. Under the banner Operation Sherwood, we have launched a major further criminal investigation so as to seek justice for those who have suffered so gravely. I can tell you that the team, in similar investigations, notwithstanding literally dozens of arrests, have already charged 13 offenders with a total of 187 offences, and these cases are currently being brought before our courts. This same approach under Operation Sherwood will be applied with real vigour to Oldham-based offenders in the coming weeks and months. It is regrettably the case that the dreadful harms and trauma that have been suffered by the people highlighted in this report, and much as we might want to, we can't turn the clock back. But we can do something on their behalf in respect of those who have behaved so despicably in preying upon vulnerable children in the awful ways that are described. My message to those offenders is a simple one. If you think you have got away with it, you are wrong, and we are coming for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Constable. Deputy Mayor Baroness Beverly Hughes has been leading the steering group on child sexual exploitation, which has been overseeing the progress of this review. So I'd now like to invite you, Bev, to address the meeting.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good morning, everybody. I'd just like to make some brief concluding remarks, really, as Andy says, as the chair of the steering group that has overseen this CSE review work for over the last 4 years now. But first, I want to put on record my thanks to Malcolm Newson and Gary Ridgway for the meticulous and professional way in which they've undertaken the review and the advice they've given me and the steering group along the way. It is their independence which they rightly uphold vigorously, and the expertise and their experience in this difficult field for which they are nationally recognised, that gives the review and its findings both authority and credibility. And similarly, I also want to thank Lisa Waters and her colleagues at the Sexual Assault Referral Centre that we call SARC at St Mary's Hospital, Manchester. Lisa has also been a member of the steering group throughout and ensured that our intention that the best interests of the survivors of abuse were front and centre of the review, and the way it was conducted, that we fulfilled that ambition. And SARC has also offered support directly to survivors and to others who've come forward for help as a result of hearing about the review. The review has involved the detailed examination of many documents, records and correspondence, as well as interviews with a significant number of people. The process of identifying the documentation that needed to be examined is painstaking and led to many requests from the review team to the police and to Oldham Council to search and produce further material. Similarly, the identification and contacting of relevant individuals is time-consuming and not always straightforward. However, I can say, and I do want to be able to say this, as chair of the steering group, that I am satisfied that the review team have had access to everything they have asked for, and I appreciate the efforts made by officers both in GMP and Oldham Council to produce everything that was required. When the then leader of Oldham Borough Council, Councillor Sean Fielding, asked the Mayor and I if we would include Oldham in the review work, his starting point was to investigate claims on social media that members and officers in Oldham Council had covered up sexual exploitation of children. We made it clear to him, and he readily accepted, that the scope of the review could not be confined to that narrow focus, but that the review team would be bound to follow wherever the evidence led and examine the response to CSE in Oldham more widely. The terms of reference and the findings of the review reflect that wider scope. And so whilst the review has found no evidence that CSE was covered up in Oldham, and indeed concluded that the strategic approach from the council and the police was in many respects ahead of that in other areas, it has found evidence of serious failings by officers and staff from both of those statutory organisations charged with protecting children, and that children, some as young as 12 and 13, were not safeguarded from serious, very serious sexual assault as a result. The review also found that social workers and police officers compounded that abuse by not believing the children, by not taking them seriously as victims, but rather seeing them as troublesome youngsters, not mobilising the child protection procedures in place at the time, and not doing anything to protect the children from further abuse. The response received by Sophie and the subsequent denial and lack of candour from both the council and the police is particularly difficult to contemplate and quite appalling. As well as failing to protect children, perpetrators, including some employed by Oldham Council, as you've heard, were not brought to justice quickly and remain free to abuse more children. You've heard today from the current leaders of Greater Manchester Police and Oldham Borough Council, Chief Constable Watson and Councillor Chatterton, their acknowledgement that all of that was wrong, their apologies, their commitments that current approaches to CSE are profoundly different today and that their organisations are striving for continuous improvement. I welcome their statements and share their commitments. Some people say that this was a different time, standards were different, social workers and police officers didn't know as much about CSE as they do now. But actually that can never be an excuse for not protecting children who are in front of you clearly as victims. The review process that we have been undertaking is inherently challenging. It inevitably presents many difficult problems that have to be resolved during its course: legal, ethical, capacity, the time it takes, for example. But it is absolutely right that when questions are raised or allegations made about such a profoundly important issue as child sexual exploitation, that we do not shy away from facing up to them openly and transparently. And so I just want to conclude by saying, challenging though it may be, we will not ever be deterred from instigating these sort of inquiries into CSE whenever necessary, and seeking assurance that everything is possible is being done, and done well, to safeguard children and young people in Greater Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bev. As I said at the start, this whole process began when I was listening to an interview given by Maggie Oliver on BBC 5 Live around the time of the BBC documentary The Betrayed Girls. And I heard Maggie make reference to Operation Augusta that was, as I said, closed down at very short notice. And I determined that I couldn't hear something like that and leave that there. And I came back and I spoke to the Deputy Mayor, and we both resolved that we would need to launch this inquiry to look into that and other allegations that were around. I want to just draw colleagues' attention to a recommendation in paragraph 220 in the online version of the report. It's not in the written version. It recognises the support that Sophie was given by the Maggie Oliver Foundation, and indeed Maggie herself. And the foundation is dedicated to the support of victims and survivors. And the review recommends that Greater Manchester Police continues to develop effective links with the foundation and other organisations to ensure the voices of survivors lead improvements. That is already happening, and I'm grateful to the Chief Constable and his team for the way in which they're now working with the foundation, and of course we accept this recommendation. But I point to it because I think it's also evidence of the way the culture within Greater Manchester Police is changing. This is a different organisation under our new Chief Constable. It is becoming a more open organisation, and the Chief Constable and I will have more to say how we entrench this culture of openness and accountability next month. I want to just touch briefly, if I could, on the question of taxi licensing that was mentioned by Amanda in her remarks. We have been through a process in Greater Manchester of proposing minimum licensing standards for all of our 10 authorities, so that all adhere to the same high standards. And it's not been without controversy. But I think this review today brings over why we have done that. As Amanda said, one of the requirements in those minimum standards is that all drivers have to be registered with the DBS update. And our standards will require councils then to conduct 6 monthly checks as to whether anything has changed. And I'm very proud to say Oldham already have that system in place. So do 2 other councils, and all 7 will have it in place. This goes beyond national standards, and I hope that is evidence of the fact that we are changing what we do, always continually challenging ourselves, as Amanda said, and seeking to strengthen our arrangements. If I might just point you towards part 3 of this review, the third and final report will be on Rochdale. And the review team have indicated to me this morning that they will now be able to focus fully on that report, and that will move forward as quickly as we can. And we will give you a timetable for that report shortly. Finally, could I just acknowledge at the end of these presentations how this is going to be a difficult day for the town of Oldham, the borough of Oldham. There's no doubt about that, but particularly for the people living within Oldham who were directly affected by these events and indeed these failures. And we're thinking particularly of Sophie today. Collectively, you've heard we as Greater Manchester are deeply sorry that they went through what they did, but we are resolved to learn and to correct things. And it's by publishing this report today, as difficult as the process has been, that we will be able to look people in the eye and say we are doing everything we can to prevent any repeat. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and for your patience. And what I now propose to do is open up to questions from colleagues in the media. And it might help if colleagues could perhaps indicate who they are directing their question towards. So, Elaine, first.
It's Elaine Wilcox, ITV Granada. It's a question to both the Chief Constable and Council Leader. We've heard of serious failings in Sophie's case, and then we hear that she was silenced from this review to cover up failings, serious failings. What does that say about your culture now?
If I take that to begin with, Amanda, well, it is, of course, one of the findings of the review which is uncomfortable because it speaks to the tendency, the misplaced tendency, at least in the minds of some, to put first the organisational reputation when actually the right thing to do, however uncomfortable it might be, is to recognise the serious failings in what, after all, is factually the case, particularly in the construct of a very vulnerable young child. And all I can say is that any attempt in our culture to put our reputation before the well-being and welfare of vulnerable people is just wrong. And it is that we are determined to correct. It is absolutely the case that, however uncomfortable it is, the very purpose of these reports is to shine a light on where we haven't got these things right. And I do have a policy of defending the defendable and not defending the indefensible, and I don't propose to try to defend that now.
Thank you. Stephen's right. What went on the sofa is absolutely indefensible. And I read that report, and I'm sure like everybody else, I was horrified. The things she endured as a 12-year-old is things a child should never, ever have to endure. I've got a 1-year-old who I'm bringing up in Oldham. And, you know, I can't even describe the emotion about when you think about your own children and that experience. She's 12 years old to go through that. And she wasn't protected by council and by the police as a 12-year-old, but then to reinforce that trauma as an adult as well is absolutely appalling. And you know, I apologise wholeheartedly for that. Now, I'm a relatively new leader, and I've been really clear with my officers. Do you know, this should be about a culture of transparency. Do you know, I'm elected to the council, like all councillors, to do the best for the town. People expect me, you know, to improve Oldham, to improve their lives, but also to protect some really, really vulnerable residents and some really vulnerable children. And even when that's difficult to swallow, you've got to be honest about your failings, and you've got to learn from that, and you've got to do better. And, you know, Stephen's right, I would never, ever try to justify what has gone on with Sophie. And we can only apologise for that and learn from that, because what happened was just not acceptable. And I will work every day as leader of this council to ensure those mistakes are never repeated going forward.
Can I just add, Elaine, before I turn to other colleagues with their hands up? Obviously, I echo everything that Stephen and Amanda have just said. There was an allegation out there that the delay in the publication of this review was political, that there was an attempt to push it beyond the May elections. Can I just assure you that the delay was to ensure that full testimony, that time was provided for full testimony to be provided, and that was a decision which Deputy Mayor and I took to make sure that everybody who wanted to speak to this review were able to speak to this review. And that is the message that's coming out from us today, because we can't sometimes defend every action of every individual working within the Greater Manchester system. But what we are doing as a leadership team today is sending the clearest of messages into that system, that we expect all victims to be heard, to be supported, and you know, that, well, it didn't happen that Sophie's voice was not in this review, but it could have done, and you know, that is something that we put wrong. And often the process of review helps you understand issues that are still within the system, and that is why it is such a valuable and important process, and it's right that Greater Manchester is going through this process. Colleague on the end.
Thank you. Phil McCann from BBC North West Tonight. This review was commissioned in 2019. Lots of the allegations that led to it seem to have come out on social media, but there were warning signs many years before that, 2011, about serious failings and concerns from reputable organisations like Ofsted. I wonder why they didn't lead to the kind of changes that were needed, because we know that those failings continued. And if I could just ask as well, and sorry, this is for the Chief Constable and the leader of Oldham Council, we know that there were 10 cases, a sample of 10 cases looked at by this review, and that now the Council and Greater Manchester Police are going to consider whether any further action can be taken in respect of the men who exploited these children. That's from just a sample of 10 cases. What about the rest?
Okay. If I take the latter end of your question first, the 10 cases that have been reviewed are a sample, and it doesn't speak to the total picture. But we don't know what the total picture looks like until we get into the detail. What I would be saying is that, as already indicated, we have already resourced a significant increase in the resourcing available to do this work. We will be looking at each of the 10 cases with a view to taking our inquiries wherever the evidence might lead. I do know, sadly, from past experience, that when you start to disentangle what are very often very complex situations, that new victims become apparent, offenders become identifiable where previously perhaps their identities were not known, and these inquiries can tend to mushroom. None of that detracts from our determination to hold people accountable. I've already indicated that in similar allied investigations, we are already making great strides, and that is our pledge going forward. We will bring the same vigour and professional approach to this going forward, because, again, we can't turn the clock back, but we can, on behalf of victims, hold people accountable for the dreadful harms that they've inflicted. Insofar as the first point that you were making, why, when perhaps things were being surfaced through regulatory bodies, inspections and the like, why had these things not necessarily led to early reform? And candidly, I think that it is an iterative process. I do think it perhaps unfair to say that we've gone from nothing to where we currently stand. This has been an incremental process of improvement and reform. I think the report sets out very fairly how, in fact, much of certainly the practice in Oldham, of course we see this across Greater Manchester, right from 2011 onward, has consistently been observed to be good and in some cases outstanding. I just think that fundamentally, systemically, we are all collectively getting better at this. And what we do have in the final thought is a set of multi-agency arrangements which are now ubiquitous, and therefore the inspection regimes, whether it be Ofsted in terms of local authorities, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Fire and the Rescue Services, for us, those regulatory authorities are holding us to a common standard against a thing which is now well described and encapsulates what good practice looks like. And I think it's that incrementally will continue to drive us to improve. It is, of course, not before time, but these things sometimes do happen incrementally, as we know in other walks of life. Amanda?
I think, as I laid out in my statement, safeguarding children and keeping children safe and looking after vulnerable children is a continuous journey. And it's a journey that every single council in this country is on. There's not a council in this country that could say child social care in their area is perfect. And there's something about, we tried to be better in 2011, but we also tried to be better than we were last week and yesterday, and we keep on moving forward. And you'll never, ever get to the point where you have a perfect social care system. Now, obviously you referenced 2011, and things were highlighted in 2011 by Ofsted, but overwhelmingly over the past 12 years for our Ofsted inspections, the headline message has always been, if you go back and read them, no child in Oldham is unsafe. We're tested by Ofsted. We have a 3 to 4 week inspection every 3 to 4 years. Normally we have twice yearly thematic inspections or focus inspections, and we've had them in the past few years on CSE in particular. And then we have peer reviews as well. So it's not like we are open to being inspected, and we are open to testing ourselves against good practice. What the report clearly does state, though, from 2011 to 14, we did employ practices that were seen as system leaders. But obviously, you look back 8 years on and you think we could have done things differently then. And that's the nature of it. Probably in 8 years' time, I'll look back on today and think maybe I could have done something different to what that was. But we were honest about what went on. The report references quite heavily the blog from Leader A. We didn't shy away from it. We were honest with the public about the growing concern around CSE and around grooming and around particularly some of the issues with our shisha bars in the town centre. So it's never been something we've hidden from, and it's not like we've never been honest with the public about where our challenges are. But it is a continuous journey of improvement. And I, laid out the challenges we face today with the number of children open to us now. We've got more children open to us now for social care than we did do in 2011. And that's on 45% less revenue budget, more people in poverty. And that is a continuous challenge that we face every single day as a council. But our social workers face it in Oldham, but they face it across the country as well. And unfortunately, that is the nature at the moment of social care in this country. But we try, and I go to work every single day to improve the lives of those children and young people, slightly better than it was last week, and slightly better, than it was yesterday. And that to me is what I'm elected to do, and that's what we as councillors are elected to do. But it's also what council taxpayers pay our officers to do as well. We are servants of the people, and we have to do our best for them and drive forward improvement.
Thanks, Amanda. So, colleague here.
Hello, Charlotte Green, Manchester Evening News. This is a question, I suppose, mostly for Amanda, but also for Stephen Watson. Do the findings of this report, to any extent, vindicate the allegations made online by blogger Raja Mir, also known as Recusant Raja, which to some extent are largely the reason why this review was launched in the first place in 2019?
Thank you. I don't know whether, as well as Amanda and Stephen, but whether Malcolm would want to comment on that, because it is obviously the finding of the review and the reasons for the finding, but you directed it towards Amanda. I don't know whether you wanted to say anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, Malcolm obviously can come in because he's written the review. But no, it doesn't. The report quite clearly states there was no cover-up whatsoever. And when Sean instigated this review in 2009, obviously that was in response to, quite a lot of residents' concerns. Some of that had sprang up online, well, a lot of that had sprang up online around a cover-up between Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police, and that we actively hid this abuse for, electoral and political advantage. And the report clearly states there is absolutely no evidence to substantiate that claim whatsoever. And to me, I'm not surprised by that, and I wasn't surprised. I didn't expect there to be a cover-up. Nobody becomes a councillor or goes into local government to cover up child sex abuse. It's just not the reality of where we are. We go into it to improve people's lives and to do the right thing and to do the best for the town, for that time that we're in office. And to me, it absolutely puts to bed that notion that we've had in Oldham and it's over 2.5 years now. It's probably 3 years getting on. Well, it will be 3 years this November, won't it, for the report? But it absolutely puts to bed that no politician and no officer of Greater Manchester Police or officer of the council was involved in any kind of cover-up. And actually, we were really honest and really open about the challenges we faced at the time in relation to CSE.
Thanks, Amanda. Malcolm?
Yeah, thank you. If I could just add to that, we were obviously mindful of the allegations on social media. but we were determined that our report focused on the evidence in respect of what happened throughout that period. And we always followed where the evidence took us. And I'm very mindful you've only just been given a very substantial 200-page report, but we have deliberately laid out all of the evidence we've looked at so that actually the reader can understand why we've come to our opinions, because we don't make our conclusions lightly. And we're absolutely confident that the allegation that senior politicians were covering up both the existence of child sexual exploitation and also the complexity of tackling it there is no basis for that allegation. So we're very clear about that, and we laid all out. And we have literally looked at thousands and thousands of emails and documents to support that. And much of the report reproduces the actual email so people can understand that. What you will also see is that it is possible to take one or two emails out of context and create a different narrative. And that's why we've gone to so much trouble to put so much detail into the public domain.
Thanks, Malcolm. Colleague there.
Thank you. Josh Halliday at The Guardian. For the Chief Constable and Councillor Chatterton, please. Has any disciplinary action been taken against any individual with respect to the failings identified in the report? Particularly interested in the response to Sophie's case and the response by the Council and GMP in 2019 and 2020. You know, it's not ancient history, it's not a different era. These are probably senior serving managers who it's suggested misled MPs on the Home Affairs Select Committee. Is there any investigation into less than candid response by the police? The council officer was suggested that she was in charge of safeguarding at the time, and her response was supported by the council's legal department. I mean, these are people who, are still at the council, it sounds like, and are involved in what is suggested to be a cover-up of, your agency's own failings.
Thanks, Josh. Stephen?
So I think the nub of my answer to this will be where misconduct is there to be discovered, it will be properly dealt with. I've already indicated that I have a team who are going through this report line by line. I do want to understand precisely what the dynamics were behind each of the points of evidence that are pointed to by the report in reaching certain conclusions. That will include having a very careful look at who precisely was involved in all of the dynamics described, and where any misconduct, specific misconduct, is identified, we will, with stakeholders, independent office, police complaints to begin with, we will make a joint assessment of where we take that. What I would say is that thus far, much of what has been picked up upon in terms of individual behaviours falls more into the learning than the bold misconduct element. But it simply is the case that there are some uncomfortable findings in this report, and we need to get to the bottom of the whys and the wherefores, and that's precisely what we're set up to do.
Thanks, Stephen. So what I would say is that the vast majority of our staff and our social workers go to work every day in really challenging circumstances to look after and protect some very, very vulnerable children. However, that does not justify some of those things in that report, and particularly the failings and the response from the council to Sophie as an adult were unacceptable. And that is not justifiable. Now, we'll be going through this line by line as well, and if there is action to be taken, then we will take that action. I do think the majority of it falls around a cultural issue. And as I said previously, I've come in as leader, and I see our role to be a culture of transparency. it is not a failing to apologise if you've done something wrong. It is a sign of strength to apologise. And this perceived cover-up, because you read it and it does read like a cover-up, and, you know, we have to accept that. That is a failing on our part, and that's a weakness that was in Oldham Council at that time. Now, in terms of management structure in children's services, we have a brand new management structure from what it was, and you're right, it wasn't that long ago, but our complete management structure has changed. Our training changes around that, around how we have to change the culture, about being a victim focused council, and our response is all into that as well. And we won't get everything right. And I work to not repeat the mistakes that have happened with Sophie, but I can't sit here today and say I'm going to get everything right and social care is going to be perfect, because it's not. But when it's not, sometimes you have to put your hands up to apologise, to say that wasn't right, but we can do better, and we learn from that, and it's that continuous cycle of improvement. But we will be looking at it line by line. Like you say, it's obviously quite a significant report and quite chunky, so but we'll be going through it line by line to take any learning from it and to implement that at the council.
Thanks, Amanda. I think, Josh, just to add, if I could quickly, you know, what you've identified is part of the point of what we're doing here. You know, we are going through a difficult process that is flushing things out that we need all to be aware of. And as you've heard from the Leader of the Council and the Chief Constable, there will be follow-up, and that's the whole point of the process that we're engaged in, and it's an ongoing process. Colleagues want to... Pat?
Sorry, it's Pat from Press Association, Pat Hurst. Can I ask Mr Newsom, did you, is there a figure for the number of potential other girls like Sophie that you identified? And is there a figure for the number of other potential offenders that you identified during this period?
So, in the detail of the report, you'll see that the local safeguarding board was regularly receiving reports about the prevalence of child sexual exploitation within the borough of Oldham. And actually that occurs at the moment, over the whole of Greater Manchester. And we identify the fact that these reports were regular, they were transparent, they were going to senior politicians as well as the local safeguarding board. And from memory, they would generally be running at any time about 70, 80 children who had a flag against them as potentially being at risk. Now, Leader A, who actually put out a blog in terms of saying we must never shy away from child sexual exploitation, actually in one of his blogs puts these numbers down so that everybody who read his blog would understand that. So the principal argument is that the council was aware and they were endeavouring to tackle it, and in that way they are no different to any other local authority in the country, and in many senses it shows that they were on the case.
70 or 80 per year?
At any one time, they would say that we were actively working with that number of children who potentially had a minor, moderate or severe risk of child sexual exploitation. Now, those numbers aren't the same as the 10 children we've sampled within our report. Quite rightly, what we didn't want to do is just look at the strategic or the policy approach to child sexual exploitation. We wanted to say, but in reality, what impact was this having on the ground to those children who were identified at risk? Now, to be absolutely clear, and we're clear in our report, this wasn't a random sample. We deliberately chose those children who had been drawn to our attention, either because we'd seen emails where people were concerned about them, or our interviewees had said that, you know, if you want to really know what was going on, look at this child, look at that child. And they were the 10 cases that we looked at. And it was a good test because we'd come to a view, as we've said, that many of the policies and the practices and the procedures were good. They weren't translated into effective protection to those individual children, and that was the weakness. In terms of offenders, the local safeguarding board did collect data on that. Again, the numbers would be who they were working with at any one time. No, not that we were looking at, because there will be many suspects. There will be many men whose names will be known, and that would be a matter that was for both the police and the local authority in their risk analysis.
Gary, I'm just wondering if you wanted to add anything.
It is different from our Augusta work, where because Augusta was a big, broad investigation, we were able to pick out individuals who posed a risk to children, who were clearly suspects or whatever. This is a different type of review, and what I would like to say is, you know, sometimes reviews like ours can be very clinical. You know, X number of children were by raped X number of times. What Sophie's, including her chapter, in allows us to actually reflect on what, you know, a 12-year-old child went through at the time, what sexual exploitation means. We're really keen to include our 10 case studies in our published review, but we can't have our cake and eat it. When we've engaged with some of our survivors, they've been clear that's not what they've wanted. So if we had been able to include those 10 cases, that might have answered your question more, because it would have been clear, you know, the individuals who potentially posed a risk for those children or actually went and sexually abused them. But it's a different nature of a review we were doing in this case than it was to Augusta.
Thanks, Pat. Colleague on the second row.
Just firstly, perhaps for Stephen Watson, I've spoken to the woman identified as Sophie, and she wants to know whether you can confirm that a separate investigation, considering the new evidence, will be launched into her case. And also, perhaps for Malcolm, another victim that I have spoken to has said she was made aware recently she would be featured in the review, and she believed that the details of her case would be published. She'd prepared herself for that. They haven't been, and she wants to know why she thinks that her case has been brushed under the carpet.
Stephen?
So, firstly, as I've indicated, arrangements are in hand for me to meet with Sophie personally. And I am aware, of course, that, and understandably so, and rightly so, Sophie has some requests and requirements of her own. And what I have said is that in addition to the opportunity to apologise to her face-to-face, I will receive from her and those supporting her any representations that she wishes to make, and we will make a shared determination as to the way forward.
But no confirmation at the moment on the investigation?
Well, with all due respect, I'm going to have a conversation with Sophie and the people who are supporting her. I don't propose to have that conversation by proxy.
In terms of the individual you talked to, we weren't party to those conversations, so you'd have to follow that up with both the police and the council, who I do know did visit the 10 individuals we referred to in the report. What we're clear about is that we didn't want our report to cause any distress. We put the conclusions in the report. We had the advantage of having spent many, many hours with Sophie, and we were able to ensure that Sophie was comfortable about her details being put in the public domain. As we've said, the 10 other cases are illustrative examples of the quality of work, and we've summarised that in our report.
Just on that woman, I think she was visited by the police and the council, and she thought that her story was going to be featured in the review, so she was surprised that it wasn't, and she wants to know why.
So I wasn't involved in what went into the confidential aspects of the report. I understand, though, that those other 10 were put in the confidential part because of, like Malcolm said, potential distress to victims. You don't want to re-traumatise victims. Stephen obviously has put plans in place to meet Sophie, and I'll be writing to Sophie and the 10 as well to offer to meet personally to discuss their experiences. And if there's anything they want to discuss about how it can inform our learning, then I'll be happy to hear that. But I wasn't involved in what went into the public and the confidential part of the report, so I can't comment on that in detail.
I think to be clear, it was a judgment because we would have liked to include those 10 cases. But if we're getting feedback quite late in the day that it is causing distress and some serious distress, we had to jump one way or another. And in discussions with the steering group, it was decided to move them into the confidential area. So if she's distressed by that, then I'd personally like to apologise for that, because we do feel very strongly that we would like to tell their stories. But it was a case really that we needed to include all 10. Could include 1 and say 9, it just creates all kinds of confusion. So we made a decision with the steering group, we believe in the best interest overall to those survivors.
Thank you. Colleague on the front row.
Hi, I'm Nick Statham from the Manchester Evening News. A question for Chief Constable Watson and Councillor Chatterton. What assurances can the public have that the mistakes and shortcomings of the authorities highlighted in this report will never be repeated? Has a multi-agency response and legal framework evolved to keep up with the threats to the CSE threats? So, evolved to keep up with the threats. Sorry, with the CSE threats of today.
Thank you. I mean, the assurance that is absolutely there to be given today is that we have moved on considerably from the time when this report references very grave weaknesses in our joint approach. But if I just unpack a little bit about what that perhaps looks like in practical terms. So all of our staff, I'm speaking from a parochial perspective initially, all of our staff in GMP are specifically trained in identifying child sexual exploitation, and a very specific but important element of that training is recognizing the difference between a child who is presenting very often with very complex needs. In the past, I think people struggle to get beyond the presentation of very difficult behaviors and circumstances, sometimes, of course, wrapped up in addition in that the child was involved in criminality. The difference, of course, today is that it is absolutely recognized that all too often those signs and symbols were really symptoms of the trauma suffered by individuals, and sorting out the difference between somebody who's simply being difficult and somebody who is perhaps being difficult, but difficult understandably because the trauma they have suffered has really ruined their lives, and to get behind why on earth are these challenging behaviours presenting themselves. That training is out there for all of our people, every single one of them. Immediately that any signs of CSE become apparent, we have specialist officers. Those specialist officers are aligned across every part of the geography in Greater Manchester, and it does reflect in the way that those officers are constructed and laid across partnership relationships. It does reflect national best practice. Where those referrals are made, specialist officers immediately pick up the baton. At every part, in every part of Greater Manchester, we do have multi-agency complex safeguarding hubs, which means that you have knowledgeable people who are passing into those hubs the sort of information that then takes root in coming up with a plan, a specific plan that pools all of the available knowledge from all partner agencies such that you come up with a bespoke, capable plan. The sort of things that were all too often missed, and this report gives good examples of those. And last but not least, in circumstances where we have missed opportunities in the past, our Force CSE unit exists to do the work, which is, I'm afraid, suboptimal in the sense that harms have already been caused to people. And I've made the point, much as we would want to, we can't turn the clock back. But the assurance is that any perpetrator, regardless of the passage of time, will be pursued relentlessly I've already indicated that we have a number of people charged of multiple offences, and I've announced the creation of Operation Sherwood as the next leg in this enterprise, Operation Sherwood being about Oldham-based offenders. And again, the assurance that I give you in that context is that to the fullest extent available to us, we will be making further arrests and prosecuting people who may mistakenly think that they've got away with it. All of those things taken together, I hope, comprise a bit more in the way of reassurance as to how it is we align our business with partner agencies. And perhaps the last point is the one that I made earlier about complacency. I am not, frankly, going to sit here and tell you that never will this happen again. It is a fact that people have always sought to abuse children. People are today seeking to abuse children. We have to get better at preventing that in the first place. But when, God forbid, it happens, we need to work really quickly to nip these things in the bud, hold people properly to account, and to safeguard those children effectively at the very first opportunity available to us as public agencies.
Thanks, Stephen. Colleague on the...
Yoshi Herman from the Mail. A quick question for Mr. Newsom. You've obviously worked in a lot of different authorities, looked at a lot of different systems. Was the scale of children who were vulnerable to CSE in Oldham that you found, was it higher or lower or roughly average compared to what you've seen before? You say on page 54 of the report that at one point in 2012 there were 38 children who were identified by Children's Social Care as being at risk of CSE. Is that a particularly high number? And the same question to the Chief Constable, please.
No. It was a very typical response for the time. And in that sense, you know, each and every one of those numbers is a child at risk, and I don't make light of it. But Oldham was at least aware of them, they were monitoring them, and they were putting in place the policies and the procedures to tackle that prevalence. So in that sense, we give credit to Oldham Council for all of that, as did Ofsted at the time.
Stephen, did you want?
Yes, just to add to that, excuse me, insofar as the numbers are concerned, candidly, I have no doubt that the numbers involved are shocking to people because they are a bigger number than people might think is typical. Alas, it is not atypical. I have spent a lot of time in policing and have spent a lot of time working in different parts of the country. It is not atypical, but it is a higher number than people might perceive to be normal. And it is that, really, that I think just illustrates the central point around complacency. We all, I think, have to accept that this is a much bigger phenomenon than any of us have hitherto appreciated. We know collectively that this is a very unpleasant, unsettling chapter in our country's story. We know that in the past this was dealt with very, very poorly, and it was an unseen problem. If there's any good in it, of course we know it now. But frankly, the idea that these cases are few and far between and that they do not therefore justify the pressure, if you like, on public agencies, on teachers, on people in care, positions of pastoral care in our communities, on us as parents, on us as adults, I just think it's salutary, and to that extent it's positive.
Colleague.
Hello, I'm Sangeeta Lal from ITV News. Mr Burnham, you yourself have said that you raised and set up this review after hearing failings on the radio. My question is actually to the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police and Councillor Chatterton for Oldham. How were so many people's stories ignored for so many years or not seriously considered until now? You've said yourself child sexual exploitation is an unseen crime, but actually people were trying to show you, but nothing was done until now, really, for those people who spoke out.
So, I've accepted this report in full. It speaks very powerfully to the very type of failings that you describe. I don't think it's fair to suggest that nothing was done for anybody. I think that's too much of a stretch. I think it does have to be recognised that to a large extent there is good evidence that in fact people were working very hard to try to grapple with a problem that, in fairness, was not being effectively gripped. That is different from just a casual brushing off of the problem and an ignoring of the problem. And of course there are many, many examples. Indeed, there are lots of examples of where genuinely committed, dedicated people have stepped in, have done the right thing, have safeguarded children, and have brought perpetrators to justice. There are bucket loads of these examples, so it's important that we get this in balance. The point is, in this context, because of the harms that we're talking about, we are all seeking to embrace a counsel of perfection. Rightly so, because there can be no room for error here, given the harms that we're describing. And it is just against that benchmark, I'm afraid, that we have fallen short. And it is in that context that we are committed to improving. And all I can do is reiterate the points that I've made before. It is iterative to some extent. We were collectively 30, 40 years ago very poor at this. We are, by degree, getting a lot better at it, but we have more to do. Amanda?
I think I agree with Stephen. So the vast majority of children in Oldham at the time were kept safe. You know, social care at the time did provide the vast majority of children that needed our help and support, who were at risk of abuse or neglect. They got the support they needed. I think Malcolm just referenced, was it 38 victims, you said? So if you look at 38 victims, at the time, in 2011, we had, I think, about 2,400 children that were open to us. So when you look at it in that context, the vast majority of children were kept safe. But as I said previously, one child let down is one child too many, and there are quite very stark examples in this report, not least Sophie, about where there has been a continuum of failure. And that is unacceptable. I will never ever sit here and justify that. And it's about things were put in place for the vast majority of children, and they still, you know, we still put them in place today, but it is a continuous cycle. And it is on that journey to perfection, but perfection keeps on moving down the road, doesn't it? And we have to keep on chasing that. And that's really difficult. And that's really difficult for, you know, me as leader, when I know my job is to lead a council that keeps our children safe. And that'll be difficult for Stephen as well, and it's difficult for the public. And we have to keep on trying on that. But we do have to remember, today and then, the vast majority of children in Oldham were kept safe, and social workers, you know, went to work then and they go to work today, and they do a great job day and night, 7 days a week, in some really trying circumstances with very, very vulnerable children. And I think when we talk about trauma, you know, trauma's a massive thing that we talk about now, but it wasn't a thing that was referenced 10 years ago. Our understanding of trauma and its impact as a society has moved on leaps and bounds. And some of the things that we are criticising in the report, it talks about the structural issue within Messenger, the service that was set up to look after these children. And that is, for a lot of the public, that's a relatively boring thing, but that's about data sharing, and we didn't do it well enough. And now we've got a complex safeguarding hub. So for the first time in Oldham, you know, physically, our social and health workers sit with officers from Greater Manchester Police. For the first time ever, They are located in Oldham Police Station, and that means when that information comes in now, we are able to respond to that collectively, of a multi-agency response, and deal with that much quicker than we were in 2011. So, you know, the structural issues that come out with messengers in the report, we've worked hard to put a system in place today that wouldn't get that. So that escalation and the data sharing looks different today than it did do then. And I think that's a really important point about how we as organisations work together and work collectively to safeguard these children.
Thanks, Amanda. I just think we're coming to the end. We've just gone beyond 12. Are there any other... There's a colleague here. Any more? So this probably will be the last question, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Nigel Barlow from About Manchester. Just having read through some of the report, there seems to be some suggestions that people within the council and possibly within the police force thought that Oldham was being unfairly put under the spotlight, maybe also by the media. Would you agree with that, Councillor Chatterton?
So, no, I wouldn't agree with that, and I don't recognise that in the report, and I think I don't recognise it because the report gives examples of itself as where, you know, Leader A in particular sought to publicise this issue. It's not like we tried to sweep it under the carpet. Leader A in that blogger is referencing that report was very, very open about that. We had, you know, Operation Phoenix and we had Messenger, and there were things put in place and money invested in that, and we knew it was an issue. We had the play that toured and saw over 3,000 school children saw that, and we sought to invest in that to inform the public, but also to warn our young people about the dangers of CSE and of grooming. And we knew, and the council knew, we knew collectively, that grooming and CSE of that type was a growing concern for us. And you see in the report, it talks about the disruption activities that we did in terms of shisha bars. But the reality is, some of the progress was slow and painfully slow at times, and it took us too long to be able to do those things. And you know, we accept the failings that were on our part. There was failings within national guidance as well around the taxi drivers, and that has been put right after reports in Rochdale and Rotherham. You know, we now have much more robust procedures, and like Andy said, you know, Oldham Council now, we've gone above and beyond, if we look at the example of the taxi drivers, than what we need to do. And it's that continuing movement, isn't it? But no, I don't recognise that in the report, and the reason I don't recognise it in the report because it lays out very clearly that actually there was a political will and a political drive to publicise this and to deal with it.
It does. Thanks very much indeed, Amanda. Thank you, colleagues, for all of your questions and for your attendance today. Malcolm and Gary will be available for one-to-one interviews because it's important that the authors of the report are able to get over the contents of the report. But with that, I'm going to call this to a close and thank you again for coming.